One of the greatest challenges in genealogy today is understanding that not every culture preserved history in the same way. Modern genealogy has largely been built around a European framework. We rely heavily on written documents such as birth certificates, marriage records, wills, land deeds, church registers, military records, and government censuses. These are considered the gold standard of genealogical evidence in Western research. However, this approach reflects the traditions of societies that developed extensive bureaucratic systems of written record keeping. Many indigenous societies around the world preserved their history differently. They recorded their ancestors through oral traditions, ceremonial practices, songs, place names, kinship systems, and community memory. When Western researchers encounter histories that were preserved in a different format and immediately dismiss them as myths or legends because they do not fit Western standards, we are not necessarily exposing false history. Often, we are exposing a failure to understand another culture's method of preserving truth. The Western genealogical tradition emerged from societies where governments, churches, and legal institutions documented individuals and families. The modern field of genealogy places tremendous importance on documentary evidence because written records allow researchers to examine information independently, compare sources, identify contradictions, and construct conclusions that can be tested and repeated. This approach is incredibly valuable. It has allowed millions of people to reconstruct their ancestry across hundreds of years. The issue is not that Western genealogy is wrong. The issue arises when we incorrectly assume that Western methods are the only legitimate methods for preserving ancestry. A written record is not the same as a truth. It is a human-created document produced by a person with their own limitations, cultural biases, political motivations, and potential for error. History is filled with incorrect census records, misspelled names, inaccurate ages, false parentage, deliberate omissions, and records that simply never existed. Genealogists know this very well. We frequently work around gaps and mistakes in the documentary record. One of the most important concepts any historian or genealogist must understand is that the absence of a surviving document does not prove that something never happened. Entire archives have been destroyed through war, colonization, natural disasters, government policies, and the simple passage of time. Even within European genealogy, we routinely encounter situations where records simply do not survive. A researcher tracing a family in a rural region of Europe in the 1400s does not conclude that the family did not exist because no birth certificate survives. They understand that the records were either never created or no longer exist. Yet, indigenous histories have often been held to a different standard. European explorers, colonists, and later scholars frequently documented indigenous oral traditions, but interpreted them through a European worldview. Stories that carried historical information were often categorized as folklore or mythology, rather than considered possible records of genealogy, migration, political alliances, or significant historical events. For many indigenous cultures, the people themselves were the archives. Specialized knowledge keepers carried histories that were passed from generation to generation through highly structured systems of oral transmission. This was not random storytelling. These traditions often contain detailed information about family relationships, territorial boundaries, migrations, major environmental events, alliances, conflicts, and the responsibilities of different families or clans. Many oral traditions were preserved through strict cultural protocols. Certain individuals were entrusted with the responsibility of remembering and transmitting this knowledge accurately. In some societies, these oral historians spent their entire lives learning complex histories that could span dozens of generations. To dismiss these traditions because they were not written down is to misunderstand the very societies that created them. Much of what survives in archives today was created by governments, churches, military officials, colonists, and wealthy landowners. These institutions decided what information was important enough to record. Indigenous peoples were often documented only when they interacted with colonial systems. A person may appear in the historical record because they signed a treaty, converted to Christianity, sold land, appeared in a court case, or became involved with colonial authorities. This does not mean their history began when Europeans started writing about them. They had names, families, political systems, leaders, territories, and ancestral connections long before they appeared in European records. The historical record often tells us more about the priorities of the people writing the records than it does about the people being recorded. The future of genealogy and history does not require us to choose between Western documentation and Indigenous oral tradition. The strongest research often comes from bringing multiple disciplines together. A written record may confirm a name. An oral tradition may preserve the relationship between families. Archaeology may reveal settlement patterns. Linguistics may preserve connections between communities. Genetic genealogy may reveal biological relationships and patterns of migration. Each form of evidence has strengths and limitations. A responsible researcher approaches all evidence critically but respectfully. The goal is not to force Indigenous traditions into a Western framework. The goal is to understand Indigenous knowledge within the context of the cultures that created it. One common misconception is that oral history is simply a story passed casually from one person to another. In reality, many Indigenous societies developed complex systems to preserve historical knowledge. Stories often had designated keepers. They were repeated in ceremonial settings, tied to specific locations, connected to family responsibilities, and maintained through community accountability. This does not mean every oral tradition should be accepted without examination. Just as written records can contain mistakes, oral histories can change over time. The responsibility of the researcher is to analyze evidence carefully, understand the context in which it was preserved, and recognize the strengths and limitations of every source. The mistake is applying skepticism, unevenly accepting a flawed colonial record as truth, while dismissing centuries of Indigenous memory as fantasy. Good genealogy requires humility. We must acknowledge that every historical source comes from a particular perspective. A church record reflects the beliefs and priorities of the church. A census reflects the goals and assumptions of the government that created it. A colonial document reflects the worldview of the colonizer. An oral tradition reflects the cultural values and methods of preservation within a community. No source exists in a vacuum. The best genealogists are not those who simply collect documents. They are those who understand how and why those documents were created, and who recognize where the historical record falls silent. Perhaps the most important lesson is this: Indigenous peoples did not suddenly appear when Europeans encountered them. Their nations had ancient histories. Their families had lineages. Their leaders had ancestors. Their communities had systems for remembering who belonged where they came from, and how they were connected. When we insist that the only acceptable proof of ancestry is a European-style document, we risk repeating the very colonial mindset that erased Indigenous voices in the first place. The absence of a paper trail is often a reflection of colonial history, not the absence of Indigenous history. As genealogists, our purpose is not simply to collect names and documents. Our purpose is to understand human lives. Every culture has developed ways of preserving identity, belonging, ancestry, and memory. Western documentary genealogy is an extraordinary tool, but it is one tool among many. When we approach Indigenous histories with respect, humility, and an understanding of their own cultural frameworks, we gain a richer, more complete picture of the human past. The greatest mistake we can make as researchers is to confuse the absence of our preferred evidence with the absence of truth. Our ancestors spoke in many ways. If we truly wish to find them, we must learn to listen.